And I want to think about games as a type of quite literal literacy. There is a grammar to them. The designer has assigned certain rules and shapes and movements to certain meanings, but you get to produce it. Just the way you in English decide to say Microsoft loaded its operating system with bugs or Microsoft operating system is loaded with bugs. In one case, you're blaming Microsoft. In the other case, you're not. The difference is you can produce different meanings. You can produce different meanings in these games. All right. So this raises one of the most vexed questions. So I'm arguing that in the type of video games I'm interested in, where you've assigned shapes, you're not just doing sex Tetris, but you've actually assigned meanings so that as the player moves along, they're producing these meanings. It raises the vexed issue of what is the role of story in video games. And for some reason in game studies today, that, especially in the Scandinavian countries, that's a violently controversial question. You know, it's always interesting in academics why certain issues get larded with moral import. So like in literacy, the issue of whether you should or shouldn't use phonics has got sort of religious stuff connected to it in America, right? If you're pro-phonics, you're a Nazi, and if you're anti-phonics, you're something else. And the idea about what the role of story is in games is ironically another one of these religiously larded issues, if you followed it. So that people who argue that there are stories in video games are considered idiots by people who think there aren't stories in video games. Well, in fact, it is an interesting question. So let's take Castlevania. Castlevania actually, there's a whole series of... Has anybody played any Castlevania game? Okay, so there's a whole series. There's dozens of them. And they have a story. They have a rather intricate story that runs through all the games. This is part of it, right? About Alucard and Dracula and his son and killing them and people lying to and misleading each other. But it turns out, of course, this kind of top-down story, the sort of thing we associate with books and movies, is not very important to Castlevania, right? In fact, why does it exist at all? It really exists. When you realize that Castlevania is just a bunch of shapes and combinations of shapes and possible movements, and you assign them some story elements like actors and events, basically this top-down story just determines the motif and the metaphor for the game. It happens to be Dracula. See, that's why when he kills an Owl Lord or something, the Owl Lord doesn't look like an ice cream cone, right? Because basically the story is the basic metaphor, and it determines what the visual look of the game and the visual feel of the game is. But most players have, beyond that, beyond determining the basic metaphor, this type of top-down story is not very relevant to video games in general. All right, so the primary thing in a game like Castlevania that's important to the player is not the sort of story that you would get in a Henry James novel or a movie. It's, in fact, all these just little events that you're doing. At one point, you killed a sword lord, or Alucard found a sword shield, which was very important to you in the game, or Alucard discovered a gold ring. But in fact, none of that stuff adds up to any very deep story. It's a set of meanings that you produced. We'll see in a minute why they're meaningful to you. But it's not going to add up to Henry James, right? And this is why so many people think video games can't be a profound form of art, right? Now, in a way, the reason the top-down story, the sort of nice architectural story you get in Henry James or in a profound movie, doesn't exist in video games is because video games have to allow the player to make the movements and the choices. And since the designer can't know the full range of choices you're going to make, right, he can't build into the thing such a tight top-down story that predetermines every event, because the liberating fact, or the fact that makes video games playable, is that you're making the meanings. That as you move Alucard along, you find the shield at a certain point, and you find it in a different time and a different order than I do. So that property that allows people to freely generate these meanings through their own choices and actions in a video game, which is the heart and soul of playing a video game, actually predetermines it isn't going to be Henry James. It isn't going to be a profound movie. And this is why one of our famous movie critics, Roger Ebert, I don't know if you guys know this guy, famously said video games can't be art because unlike a movie or book, they can't have these beautiful architectural top-down stories. What I'm going to suggest to you is they are art, and they are a distinctive form of pleasure, but if we hold them to that criteria, we're never going to see that, right? In a video game like Castlevania or any other, I'm just using it as an example, there are two stories at stake, one of which I've just told you is not very important. So the designer's story, that top-down story, that, you know, their Alucard is the half-son of Dracula, and so-and-so screwed so-and-so, and then he's going to... that top-down story exists just to give the motif, the visual feel of the game. It's the designer's story, and it's not the important thing in most video games. But there is another story, and that is what I'll call the virtual real story, and that is the player's trajectory through the game. Now, even in a game as simple as Castlevania, you will have gone through the game in a different order than me, right? So I'll give you an example. Outside the castle, there is this creature called the Owl Lord. He has an owl on his shoulder. And I went out early in the game to the front of the castle and tried to kill this guy and couldn't do it. Right? I kept losing. So I went back in and I killed more stuff and I did more problem solving and I got more powerful and I went out and tried to kill the guy again and I still couldn't kill him. So then I went back in and I went and found more stuff and I got better equipment. Then I went out and I killed him easily and I was very happy because I was pissed at him at that point. Right? Now, let's say you played the game and, you know, you're way better than me and you killed him the first time. Right? So after we've done this for hours, your trajectory through that space is entirely different than mine. Right? The story that you created is the events and the order and the stuff that you pulled off. And so I just told you part of my story. I was thrilled that I finally killed the Owl Lord in there, and I have to remember all the effort I had to put in to go get him and all the planning I had to do. That isn't in your story. Right? So the fact is, there is a type of story in video games which is your trajectory through the game. You've produced these so-called trivial meanings, but you've produced them in a certain trajectory that is building up your story. It isn't Henry James's story. It isn't a big architectural story. It's your story of the event of you playing this game. And in a good game, one like this one where you can revisit each place, then the path you took through all the possible ways to get through that game is uniquely yours and mine is uniquely mine. And we can sit around and compare notes. In that sense, even a game as trivial as Castlevania has what I call a deep past, because I can keep going. The way in which I can keep going back to that Owl Lord, and each time there's a different event happening, and finally get him, and then go back later. I mean, how many people played World of Warcraft? This is an Australian tragedy that more people are not playing this game. This is the most played massive multiplayer game in the world now. Western world, and it is 6 million people. It's been a complete mania. If you're into addiction, there's more people addicted to it than alcohol now. But in a game like World of Warcraft, a massive multiplayer game, people will play it so long and have returned to the same places. You'll go to a particular land that you've been in before and you've had many events happen, and every time you go back, you remember all those events. You say, oh, I remember when I started out, I was so weak and I got my ass kicked here, and I had this event, and then now I remember, you know, there's a deep past which you keep as you return to the place with more powers and you get a more trajectory, it becomes part of your history. It's got a past. You're building this sort of set of meanings at that place, but they're meanings to you. They're personal meanings. They're a meaning in your own history. Right? Something very different. This doesn't happen in a book. You don't get to go reread chapter 1 and have a different experience. Oh, I remember when I read chapter 1 before, I got my ass kicked, but now I'm more... You know, in general, you don't do that with books. I guess you could do it a little bit. All right. So at this stage, even Castlevania doesn't look quite as trivial because it's playing to making the player's story, the player's own projection of their desires important, not the architecture of the designer. See, so we're so used to the fact that when we read Henry James, the person who gets all the credit is Henry James. Right? And he shouldn't, by the way. He's so hard to read, the reader should get the credit. Right? But, you know, literary critics there's not a course in how Jim G. reads Henry James or what a great job he did because it was such a pain in the butt. It's all about what a great writer Henry James was. Right? But in fact, in a game like Castlevania, it becomes mine, right? And the set of choices are mine, and I live with them. Now, what I'm beginning to try to suggest to you, because we're going to go through deeper and deeper games, is that these very basic things hold out potential. You think of the potential of that, the possibility of creating worlds in which people's trajectories and choices are the important thing, and that each person's is different. Each person lays down a deep past of their own that they can compare and contrast with everybody else. World of Warcraft is, in a sense, already doing that, and it's a worldwide mania for people, in part because how deeply pleasurable this is and how deeply empowering it is, though it starts out sounding remarkably trivial.